Well, hello again. This is Dave Gustafson, a project director at Conservation Technology Information Center. I'd like to welcome everyone to today's webinar on OpTIS 2.0, the latest version of the Operation Tillage Information System. As indicated, we here at CTIC have been partnering with both Regrow, who are the developers of the technology that you're going to be hearing about today, as well as the Nature Conservancy, who have been our hosts for these webinars and really an organizing force behind the entire endeavor. So just a huge thank you to all of our partners. I'd like to go to the next slide, please. Today, we'll hear initially from Steve Hagen at Regrow. And then we'll have guest speakers, Linda, Margaret, and Ian, whom I'll introduce a little bit later on in the program. And then we'll finish with the Q&A at the end of the session. And I just want to make sure that folks notice that at the bottom of their screens, they will see a Q&A button, and you can direct those questions to whomever you would like. And when we get to that part of the program, Steve Warblow will be moderating that discussion. So with that, I'd like to go to the next slide, please. During that Q&A, one of the things you might be interested in doing is directing your questions to one of the specific collaborators on this project. All of the folks shown on the screen will be present to help answer those questions, and we'd love to be able to have the opportunity to do so once we get to that part of the program. So with that, and the next slide, I just wanted to say a brief word about our guest speakers. Again, I will give a proper introduction when we get there, but Linda Prokopy from Purdue University, as well as Margaret Jodlowski from the Ohio State University, and Ian Crawford from Simplot. And just a huge thank you to all three of our guest speakers today. We really appreciate it. Next slide, please. I will now pass it over to my colleague, Steve Hagen at Regrow.
Thanks so much, Dave. Yeah, so I'm Steve Hagen. I'm the Chief Research Officer at Regrow Ag. We're a new company formed earlier this year with the merger of Dagan and Florisat. And we're working with partners to help make regenerative ag more accessible and more widely adopted, working to fundamentally improve soil health around the globe. And so I'm really excited to be here with you to share some updates on the tools and information for keeping track of the use of regenerative ag across space and time. So I'm going to provide you a brief review of OpTIS and DNDC, the technology used to estimate the practices and the associated outcomes. And then I'll highlight what's new in this public release. And I'll close with a review of some of the initial results, and then outline where we're going next. And just a quick note before I dig into the details, I can't say enough about the support and the partnerships that have made this system and this project possible. You know, as Dave mentioned, we at Regrow, we've developed the technology, but that's only one part in getting a system like this off the ground and getting the data into the hands of people who can use it. So I want to mention a few of the organizations. First off, the NASA and the USDA, they funded early development of the system and provided a technical oversight board. The Foundation for Food and Agricultural Research is supporting the continued expansion of the technology. The Ecosystem Service Market Consortium is a key continuing partner in ensuring the technology can meet the needs of the market. There's dozens of certified crop advisors and soil water conservation district folks that have helped collect data across the US that we use to validate the remote sensing products. And then most critically, there's the Nature Conservancy and the Conservation Technology Information Center, including their members and supporters. They've been key partners from early on and absolutely critical to getting OpTIS off the ground, and just feel very lucky to be working with the wonderful people at those two organizations. Okay, so on to OpTIS. and this is going to be review material for many of you. So I'm not gonna spend too much time going into the details. I'll be happy to take questions today and then follow up with you, to get you the background information you need after the webinar today too. So here we are, the operational tillage information system. But OpTIS provides information more than just tillage practices. It also provides information on cover crops and crop rotations. And a few of the key details here, I think it's important to note that the system uses publicly available remote sensing data, and that the raw residue cover and cover crop estimates that we produce with OpTIS are done at the subfield scale, but the algorithms are applied across large regions, and we've expanded beyond the Corn Belt, as we'll discuss today, and we're working to expand across the US. And just to note, these data go back through time as well. They're longitudinal. So at the field scale, we track and model each of millions of farm fields through time, looking at changes in management practices, including crop rotations and tillage practices and cover cropping. And again, that information is processed at the field scale, but then summarized and distributed at the aggregated scales for public insights. And those summarized data are freely available. You can visit CTIC's website to gain access and use the new tools that we'll talk about today. Next slide, please. Yeah, so digging into the technology just a little bit, we rely on data from multiple satellite sensors, not just one, and we integrate data across the entire season. And so not just a single image snapshot. And we do that to estimate, residue cover fraction, which translates into tillage practices. And we do that for cover crops as well. And that's what we're looking at here is an example of some information from a couple of fields in Iowa. We track the level of greenness of a pixel over seasons, looking for patterns in that green signal that indicate if the pixel was cover cropped or if it had a winter commodity crop like winter wheat, or if it had no winter cover. And so, with OpTIS, we can gain an understanding of the spatial patterns and the temporal patterns, the patterns through time that allow us to get at questions like, what is the baseline level of adoption against which we can measure improvements? And I think this type of information is valuable in and of itself, but we can combine OpTIS observations of management with powerful biogeochemical models to gain, deeper insights into the outcomes associated with those management choices. So next slide. So that's where in this project, we're using the DNDC biogeochemical model. And DNDC stands for denitrification decomposition. It's what we call a process-based model, and it uses ag management, in this case from OpTIS, weather information and soil information as input. And by modeling soil microbial processes and vegetation growth and the carbon and nitrogen cycles, the model produces estimates of soil organic carbon, greenhouse gas emissions, and other attributes. So again, this modeling is happening at the farm field level, where we track and model each of the millions of farm fields through time. We look at the changes in management practices, and then we model the associated outcomes on those fields. And I think now's an appropriate time to mention this sort of additional advantage of using satellite-based estimates for mapping the practices. That way we can track important information on the field level from year to year. Information such as how many consecutive years has a field been in no-till. And I think as you all know, that type of information is really important when it comes to soil health outcomes, and that's captured here. So we run the DNDC model with the management data as input, but more than that, we also run a set of counterfactual scenarios. For example, what if a grower had never used conservation practices on a field? And we compare the outcomes of the observed practices to the outcomes of the counterfactual to better understand the soil health benefits of the practices. And the rest of my comments today are going to focus on OpTIS practice data, the management data, but I want to note that the DNDC simulation results are available, and we've got Bill Salas here standing by if you've got DNDC model related questions at the end. Next slide, please. And I just want to briefly touch on how OpTIS observations are linked to the ground data. And as we discussed, OpTIS estimates, they're based on satellite observations and their algorithms. They're not perfect. We get estimates wrong in some places at some times. How do we know that? Well, we know that by comparing OpTIS estimates to observations taken on the ground. And we've collected, by this point, well over 1,000 observations on well over 1,000 fields in the US. And the accuracy is pretty good. It's over 85%. It's not perfect, but it's good. We also compare OpTIS estimates to county level NAS Ag Census data. And we see good correlations there too. And so the comparison of these satellite-based estimates to other sources gives us some confidence, in our estimates and guides us to where we may need improvements. And I'll just note at the last line there that the details of this comparison and all kinds of other details about the project can be found in the recently published paper in the journal Land. Okay, so that's the background on the technology, and for many of you, that's a review. So so what's new here in the release? I think there are 4 new aspects to the release, and we're extending in time up through 2019 cropping season. We're expanding in space. We've got a few tweaks to the algorithm that I'll mention, and then we've got new ways to explore the data. Next slide, please. So extension in time up through 2019, it's pretty simple. We're including information on winter cover crops from the 2018-2019 winter season, as well as spring tillage in 2019, fall tillage in 2018. And in space, we've expanded, adding new watersheds in Wisconsin, in Michigan, in Tennessee, and Kentucky, and we've expanded to cover all of Kansas. Our expansion across Kansas is our first application in areas where wheat is dominant. So next slide. I think that highlights one of the key changes we've made, adjustments we've made to the algorithm. We've extended the observation window to allow for improved residue cover estimates following the harvest of winter wheat, which obviously occurs later in the season than typical spring planting of corn and soybeans. And I think, potentially the most exciting changes that we've made are in how we can look at the data. And there, we received a lot of feedback after our initial release. I think folks sort of stakeholders asking for a wider view into how soil health practices are used in combination. Questions like, how often are cover crops planted into corn residue? How often is no-till done before the planting of soybeans? How many acres are in no-till with cover crops? Questions like this that sort of extend across different management types. And in this release, we've provided summaries of acres across the practices applied from summer crop through to the next season's summer crop. And so next slide, please. So for example, I think, is there one more slide? Next one, there we go. There's there's the one with the table. So for example, we can look at, in 1 year after the corn is harvested, we want to know how many acres after that corn harvest were no-tilled in the fall, where no cover crops were planted in the winter, where no-till was done in the spring, and then soybeans were planted in the summer. And so now we can, the answer to that in this watershed, near Pottawatomie County, Indiana. The answer there is 2,622. So we've really expanded the view into how practices are used in combination. And we hope that this added level of detail allows for, more flexible and expansive view into the practices. And then when you head over, next slide, please. When you head over to the CTIC website, you'll see those changes, including the ones sort of highlighted here. There's the new ability to choose from a 2-year cropping rotation. You can see that sort of at the banner part of the website. And there are new ways to view changes over time, including this new bar chart on the right showing changes in practice use over time by region. We're excited about the new changes and hope you're going to find them useful. The tool is available now. We're making some final adjustments and we're creating a video that will be available soon to guide you through the use of those features. So next slide, please. So that's the summary of what is new. And then so what are the data showing us? There are so many ways to dig into these data. And I'm just going to share with you just some of the top line sort of results from the update. So first, looking across the landscape, here we're looking at cover crops on the left, cover crop use on the left, and conservation tillage on the right. And we see clusters of the use of cover crops and different clusters of the use of tillage practices. Some patterns, I think, can be linked to climate and environment conditions, like the higher prevalence of cover crops in the southern part of the study area. And then other patterns seem to align more with administrative boundaries, like the cover crop use pattern on the border of Wisconsin and Minnesota. That sort of sticks out as sort of an administrative boundary cluster that we see. Next slide, please. And then through time, we can also see patterns, and 2 changes over time here stick out to me. I think on the right, we see the use of conservation tillage retreat a little bit from the highs seen in the first half of the 2010s, from where we had about 50% conservation tillage use observed in the first half of the decade, but that dropped a bit to 43% on average in the second half of the decade. And then on cover crop use, we see cover crops use double from the first half of the 2010s to the second half. I think those are just sort of the top level results that we're seeing there. And before I hand the mic over to the researchers and stakeholders who are using this information in more interesting ways, I want to close with a quick glimpse into our next steps. Next slide, please. So we're adding a couple of key geographies, including the Chesapeake and Mississippi Delta and the Great Plains. We're continuing to add new years, including obviously 2020 and then beyond. And we're always looking to make algorithm improvements, including based on information we gather from comparing to ground observations and to ag census. So that's what's in store for us next. And I really appreciate your time and attention, and I'll put the mic back over to you, Dave.
Well, thanks very much, Steve. And just a quick reminder for everyone that we will have Q&A at the end of the session. So type your questions there if you wouldn't mind. Our first guest speaker is going to be Dr. Linda Prokopy from Purdue. Her role there is professor and department head in the Department of Horticulture and Landscape Architecture, and also director of the Indiana Water Resources Research Center. She's an interdisciplinary social scientist who has been looking at all of the issues that we've been talking about here today in terms of the adoption of conservation practices. So We really appreciate Linda joining us. And without further ado, let's hear from Linda.
Thanks, Dave. So yeah, we've been interested for a long time in what explains variation in county level adoption rates. We certainly knew from some of the work that we've been doing that there were some sort of cultural things, there are some differences between counties, but it was really hard to tease those out. And OpTIS data allowed us to do that. So we partnered with the Nature Conservancy, who funded this work, and this work was actually led by my former postdoc, Dr. Roxandra Popovici. And one thing that the Nature Conservancy had already figured out from the data, and Steve said this as well, is that cover crop adoption is higher in regions with higher temperatures and higher precipitation levels, right? But those biophysical characteristics or the climate characteristics don't fully explain differences in cover crop adoption between counties. So what we did in this study is if you could advance slide, thank you. I was trying to advance myself, I forgot. We looked at the data from 2016 to 2018 from OpTIS, and we started in 2016 because we noticed an increase in cover crop adoption in 2016 in the OpTIS data. And there seemed to be strong differences between counties that started to appear in 2016 as well. And so we took the average of adoption rates from 2016, 2017, and 2018 and came up with these maps. And what you can see here is that these counties that have the green or the red star are in similar climatic zones, but have different rates of cover crop adoption. So we use something called a control case comparison method, where we didn't physically go to these counties because we did this work during COVID. We did online focus groups with informed stakeholders in each of these counties. And we did some individual interviews as well to try to find out what was going on in these counties. So we did the focus groups in all of the counties here, the red and the green counties, to try to identify social characteristics that could explain the differences in ways that the biophysical characteristics and differences between the counties were not. And if you can advance the slide, please. What we found was that higher levels of cover crop adoption couldn't be attributed to one single factor, but really to a cluster of factors. And you can see that list here. So counties with more early cover crop adopters have more adoption. Counties with a cover crop culture, which I'll talk about more in a minute. Counties with programs beyond just the standard EQIP and CSP programming had more adoption rates. NRCS and Soil and Water Conservation District staff promoting cover crops beyond their regular duties was also important. Collaboration between agencies and entrepreneurs was important, and I'll talk about that again in a minute. And then some more sort of physical differences, more organic produce, pastured livestock, or smaller scale farms, and having more cattle were also correlated with higher rates of adoption. If we can just advance to my final slide, thank you. What you see here in this table is the list of the counties that we looked at in the columns. And I'm going to highlight two of the factors that we were able to identify here. And one was this cover crop culture. So if you look across here, the boiler gold shaded columns are the counties with higher levels of cover crop adoption than their adjacent counties. And what you see is that for most of the higher adoption counties, there is presence of what we identified as cover crop culture, and it's only present in a couple of the lower adopting counties. This cover crop culture emerged in different ways in the different counties, but was really sort of observed by growers really talking to each other about cover crops, a cultural norm that had emerged in those counties to be supportive of cover crops and to be conversely not supportive of bare fields in the winter. And so that seemed to be a really important factor, a very hard thing to artificially generate in a county, obviously, but something that had emerged over time in those counties. And then the second factor I want to highlight is this collaboration between agencies and entrepreneurs. And if you look again across the table, you see that in all of the counties with higher levels of adoption, that collaboration was present, and it is never present in the lower adopting counties, right? So it certainly emerges as a really key factor explaining increased cover crop adoption. And those, we call them entrepreneurs because it's not the same type of person in all of the counties, but sometimes it's a crop advisor, sometimes it's a farmer, but it's a real partnership between someone who doesn't work for a government agency and those government agencies really working together to lead to increased cover crop adoption, really sharing messages, being on the same page with the message that they're sharing with other producers, working together on field days, other types of events. And so without the OpTIS data, we wouldn't have been able to identify these factors, which I think are really very interesting. And I'm very excited, Steve, to hear that this is going to expand to Chesapeake Bay, because we've been talking about trying to replicate this study in the Chesapeake Bay. And so it'll be helpful to use the same methods to identify our counties there and continue to expand this work. So that's my brief story of how we've used OpTIS data. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Linda. And again, just a quick reminder to everybody that if you have a specific question for Linda, you'll be able to get that asked during the Q&A, which we'll have towards the end of the session. Our next speaker is also from academia. It's Dr. Margaret Jodlowski, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Ag, Environment, and Development Economics at The Ohio State University. Her research has been focused on issues both here in the US and internationally, with an emphasis on farm labor and household dynamics. And without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Margaret.
Absolutely. Hi, everybody. So the work that I have done with the OpTIS data relates to connecting the farm financial safety net, primarily through the federal crop insurance program, with what we consider very broadly the soil health safety net through these conservation practices that are measured with OpTIS. So the title of our work is Capturing Crop Resilience to Extreme Weather Under Conservation Practices, Evidence from Crop Insurance Indemnities. And this is joint work with Vaison Liu, a recent graduate of Cornell, Dr. Kathy Kling at Cornell, and Dr. Jenny Ift at Kansas State. Next slide, please. Thanks. So our research question, as I said, connects what we measure as crop resilience using the crop insurance indemnities in a county. And we use conservation practices from OpTIS to measure the extent to which the presence of these practices promotes crop resilience following an extreme weather event. So to put it very simply, a question we ask is, are counties with conservation practices more or less likely to receive an indemnity from the crop insurance program if they have higher rates of the sustainable practices measured using OpTIS data? And so we have sort of broken those down into a couple of different categories. The primary ones that I'll be talking about today are the cover crops and no-till, but we have plans, or ideally would like to look at other practices as well. And so I myself am coming to this project from a background where I've looked at the same question using individual farm level data, primarily from ARMS, if you're familiar with that data set. And so the benefit of OpTIS, of course, is its wide coverage and the non-response rates and the sort of evasiveness that we see in individual level response are not present. And so we get a much clearer picture at the county level of what is going on in particular with regards to these practices. And so if you could just jump to the next slide. Great. And so essentially what we do is look at an interaction between the extremeness of weather in a county using a z-score. And so the measure of difference in the county's weather during that growing season as it compares to the average of that county's weather across all past growing seasons. And so the farther the current year deviates from the mean, the more extreme we consider that precipitation event to be. And so we use that to decide how extreme the weather is in that county in that growing season. We combine that or interact that with the measure of how prevalent these conservation practices are. And that, of course, comes from this OpTIS data. And so looking at the percent of a county that is cover cropped or the percent of the county that is no-till, as well as the absolute numbers of cover crop or no-till acres, we interact those two. And then at the end, look at the likelihood that the county has received an indemnity. All of this crop insurance data, of course, comes from the Risk Management Agency or RMA. And so we look at both the likelihood that that an indemnity has been received, as well as the amount of indemnity received in total amount of indemnities received in that county in that year. And so that is sort of our proxy for crop resilience. Of course, there's a lot of other factors going on in terms of adoption, and you can think about issues related to moral hazard. And so this is just one small piece of the puzzle that relates the farm financial safety net and the sort of environmental or conservation safety net, but we think it's an important one. And it's especially important if we're going to understand how to promote these practices for farmers. If we have to have a good sense of how they're going to affect their profits, yes, but also their payouts from programs like the federal crop insurance program. See if you just want to jump to the next slide. And so I know this is a very busy set of maps, but really this is just showing on one hand the precipitation z-scores, and so the extremeness of weather across the Corn Belt in the intervening years, and then on the right hand side showing which counties receive payouts and when. And so you can see one real standout, of course, is the 2012 drought. Lots of indemnities received then. But the overlap is not perfect. And so essentially what our research asks is, to what extent does conservation practices mitigate that difference? And so our counties, our counties that do not receive a lot of payouts, even following extreme weather events, are they, is that being influenced by these conservation practices? And so I'm just going to show a brief preview of a couple of our results. Nothing, obviously there's a host of results and it's a very short time window, but just to give a flavor of what we've sort of found, if you want to jump to the next slide now. And so what this says, on the bottom, we have the z-score, so the extremeness of a growing season's weather relative to its mean. And so 1 being excess rainfall, and negative numbers being drought or lower levels of rainfall. And then on the y-axis, we have the likelihood of receiving an indemnity. And so what we're able to do is show the impact of no-till acres on the likelihood of an indemnity being received in that county in that year. And so you can see a sort of U-shaped relationship where at the more extreme ends of the weather distribution on either side, the presence of no-till acres makes it less likely that an indemnity has been received, and that effect sort of goes away as the weather becomes less extreme, more towards the middle of this graph. And then next slide. And we see a sort of similar relationship on the amount of indemnity. Again, looking at the more positive precipitation z-scores showing excess rainfall, we see indemnities are much lower in counties with no-till acres, with more no-till acres, to the tune of about $20 per acre. And then as the relationship does sort of disappear as we move either to lower levels of rainfall or less extreme positive rainfall events. And so very excited to continue this work and continue this sort of line of questioning as it relates to the OpTIS data and crop insurance. Thanks.
Well, thanks very much, Margaret. And I did just want to pause and make a personal comment, which is that after so many years here at CTIC, it is awesome to see these fantastic examples of folks from academia making such really interesting use of the information. And I hope those others, researchers out there, will hopefully take note and perhaps come up with additional findings. And again, any questions for Margaret, just type those into the Q&A box, and I'm sure she'll be happy to answer them at the end. So I'd like now to turn to our third guest speaker today, who's a member of the CTIC Board of Directors representing Simplot. Ian Crawford is a U.S. Navy veteran and a certified crop advisor. He has 22 years experience in ag and has led in roles as a crop advisor, technical service rep, product manager, etc. He's currently serving as not just a board member at CTIC, but also a 4Rs committee member at the Fertilizer Institute, Sustainability Committee Chair, CropLife America, and in the Carbon Climate Work Group at Ag Retailers Association. So we're really pleased to be joined by Ian.
Thank you, Dave, and thanks everybody. Appreciate the opportunity to be with here today and shed a little light on how OpTIS is important to us as an organization. I've got a map here that shows our retail footprint. We are a significant ag retailer here in the United States, and you can see that there is certainly some overlap in where the OpTIS data has been generated, and also our retail ag footprint. We have about 500 crop advisors that work out of these various locations you can see on this map, and our focus is on crop nutrition, crop care, bioscience, seed, and also technology, which includes data management. I would like to preface my comments today about our customer focus and how important that is to our business. In fact, I've got a quote here from our founder, J.R. Simplot, who if you've never heard of J.R. Simplot, I encourage you to do a Google search and learn a little bit about J.R. Simplot and the success story that he was in American agriculture. But he says, we will only be here one day longer than our customers, and that really is part of our focus. We're a very customer focused business. Can I get the next slide, please? From a sustainability standpoint, these are three buckets that we like to categorize our efforts around sustainability. And the first one there is soil health and nutrient stewardship. The second being water stewardship, and then third is preserving agricultural communities and lands. Next slide, please. To our customers, sustainability is kind of a vague word and misunderstood. But when we have conversations with our customers, when we frame that around consumer demands, regulatory pressure, that's a quick way to get the stop sign. But when we really focus on how sustainability and conservation really is about benefits to the farmer, that lends itself to a more productive conversation. And really, this is important because conservation is really part of our license to operate in towards the future. Sustainability, conservation really needs to be focused on economics in addition to the ecology. Next slide, please. Back to our license to operate, we believe it's important to help growers create plans to improve ecological performance along with production ahead of regulation, to help growers adapt and be resilient to climate change, and to strengthen our industry through projects with trusted organizations and value chain partners. Next slide, please. So OpTIS. How does OpTIS fit into all this? We believe that OpTIS can help scale adoption of conservation practices, and this is becoming even more important with it seems to be one of the larger mega trends in agriculture today is around ecosystem services markets, from water quality, water quantity, biodiversity, and then of course carbon markets. But this is rapidly evolving, and we're paying keen attention here in this space. And it's important to collaborate and partner with organizations such as CTIC and the Nature Conservancy that are working to address environmental issues through an ag lens. OpTIS, to me, it looks verification costs for participating in ecosystem services markets seems to be quite high for growers to participate in these, and OpTIS has great potential to help reduce these costs at scale. We believe it's highly important to help our customers adopt these practices. It really all stems from agronomy, I'm really intrigued by some of the previous comments, especially those around risk. We believe it's really important. Again, back to the concept of only being in business for one day longer than our customers. We need to help farmers and ranchers to minimize risk, and OpTIS appears that it is has great potential to help assist in these efforts. So with that, I think I'd like to conclude my comments, and really, Dave and everyone, I really do appreciate the offer to participate here today. So thank you.
Well, Ian, and thank you. It was wonderful having you join as a guest speaker today. So I would like now to hand it over to our communications director here at CTIC, Steve Werblow, who has been reading through all of your questions. You can go ahead and keep those coming. But Steve, over to you to moderate the conclusion of our webinar today.
Great, thanks, Dave. And thanks to everybody who's been typing questions into the Q&A, which you'll find down the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. I'm going to start. We've got a lot of great questions, and we're going to answer as many as we can this afternoon, and hopefully get more information back to you if we don't get to talk to address your specific question today. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to aggregate a couple of questions that came in about the mechanics of OpTIS and what OpTIS can see or discern with its algorithm. And I'm going to direct this to Steve. We've got questions about planting green, okay, planting into a live cover crop. How does OpTIS, or can OpTIS discern that? Or is it possible to misclassify that as, say, a winter or fall forage? Similarly, there's questions about whether OpTIS can sort between fall small grains that are planted for grain versus for spring forage versus for use as a cover crop. Steve, can you kind of tell us a little bit about what the algorithm can discern?
Yeah, thanks, Stephen. Yeah, thanks for those great questions. On the planting green question, it's a good one, and it's on our radar, and we don't have field observations currently to confirm, but the logic of the algorithms, we're confident can separate those. What OpTIS is doing is looking at green cover signal across, essentially from harvest in the fall all the way through the following summer. And if we're just talking about cover crops, not planting green, but terminating the cover crop, then obviously what we're looking for is a dip in that green signal before the subsequent increase in green signal associated with that spring and summer crop. If in planting green, we're not going to get that dip, but we extend that analysis, beyond that spring summer planting window out into the summer. And when we're planting green, and that signal might, in that transition spot, look, we're not going to see that same decrease in the green signal in the spring, but we will see a definite signal associated with that planted summer crop, and be able to separate cover crop from others using that sort of phenological signal. There was another question on what types of cover crop. Does cover crop mean specific type, for instance, primarily ryegrass? At this stage, we do not separate out the type of cover crop. We've got an ongoing research project working with the USDA Agricultural Research Service in Beltsville, where we're looking at that issue as well as others to try to improve the depth of information from our cover crop product, from simply sort of presence absence to include information on timing and types as well as cover crop vigor.
Great. Steve, I'm going to keep you in the hot seat for one more round, and that is kind of a related question, and that those seem to deal with what can OpTIS pick up as far as no-till versus conservation tillage? Are there certain challenges that the algorithm has in determining conservation tillage practices or certain conservation tillage practices? And that also relates to a question about what the definitions are that underpin our definition of no-till versus conservation tillage or reduced till.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. So I would start by pointing folks to that land paper that was published, I think, in October or November of 2020. There's all of this detail in there for you. But one key point that I want to make is that OpTIS is sensitive to the amount of residue cover remaining on the soil surface. And I think there was a question also about fall versus spring. We do provide an estimate in the fall and then again in the spring. And it's so, tillage practice is more than just residue cover, in the sense that soil disturbance is a key component of tillage. And I want to be clear that the OpTIS algorithms are sensitive to the residue cover component, but not to the soil disturbance component. OpTIS validates well against ground observations of residue cover, and that's where we feel most confident. Currently, we create bins of residue cover to apply labels of tillage practices, and those are dependent on the residue cover as well as the residue cover type. And we currently classify less than 15% residue cover as conventional till. And then we have a sort of broad middle category of reduced till. And then we have a third category of no-till. And that no-till is farm fields with greater than 30% residue cover, except for those fields with corn residue on them. In those cases, we require 50% residue cover for that no-till labeling. So those are the details there, but I encourage you to look into that land paper where all of that is laid out in detail.
Great, thanks, Steve. I also put in the chat, there's a link to a paper that you prepared a couple of years ago about the sort of the underpinnings there, the logic and process behind OpTIS. So that's, you'll find in the chat. I'm going to cut you break now, Steve, and we're going to turn the spotlight over to Linda. We have a question about the Northwest out here in my area. Are the barriers to cover crops more economic or technical? What I hear in my area, Pacific Northwest, is that we have so many crops and it's really complex. This makes it challenging for people to figure it out. It requires a lot of experimenting. Does cover crop culture likely help with this knowledge?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think cover crop culture probably does help. Something we found in other studies we've done is that farmers who are systems thinkers are more likely to adopt cover crops. And I think that gets to the question asker's point about complexity of cover crops, right? That they're so complex that it's not easy to adopt cover crops, right? And we don't find, in most of our work, we don't find that money is the limiting factor, right? That certainly financial support is necessary, but it's often not sufficient, right? Without that supporting culture, shifting norms, support from your crop advisor, a change in the way you yourself think about your farm, et cetera.
Great, thank you. We're gonna point one to Margaret, and she's typing an answer. Maybe we can save you the typing and ask you how you classify growers who've improved soil health and don't take out crop insurance.
Right. So in this work, everything we do is aggregated to the county level. And so an individual farmer's decisions, whether that's about a conservation practice or about insurance behavior, we don't observe those. And so in this specific work, that's not so much of an issue. However, I have done other work where you do look at individual level farmer decisions. And in most cases, we will remove people who are non-participants in crop insurance from the sample, because otherwise it looks like the decision to not participate is a pretty distinct one. And so we usually look at those separately from participants who are involved in crop insurance, maybe at lower coverage levels or paying lower premiums, we keep those two groups separate. But yeah, feel free to follow up if that doesn't get at your question. Thanks.
Great, thank you. All right, I'm going to go back to Steve and perhaps even to his colleague Bill Salas, who's on the line as well. We have a question about DNDC. Is the DNDC output offset quality? Is there a protocol recognizing OpTIS as evidence that can be verified? And I'm going to actually expand that a little bit too to ask, what can we say with the DNDC data? What's appropriate? What conclusions can be appropriate to draw versus what is beyond the scope of what DNDC can do with OpTIS data as its input?
Dave, thank you. I'm happy to take this. So this is Bill Salas. I'm also with Regrow, the Chief Strategy Officer. And I think it's important to take a step back and think about the objectives of the DNDC modeling done for this study. And so our goal here was really to understand how the trends and adoption of conservation practices are influencing the trends in soil health outcomes. So we weren't trying to do a detailed inventory. We weren't trying to do field scale quantification of offsets, because that requires additional information that we would need for each of the fields in this geography. And we modeled well over 1 million fields, as Steve Hagen outlined. So the objective here is really to understand how the various adoption of different conservation practices affect trends spatially and temporally in this geography. So understanding, the adoption of cover crops in different regions will have a different soil health outcome based on the climate region, the cropping system being implemented on, and the actual soils where the cover crop is being implemented. So it's meant primarily to understand trends. Now, on the question regarding DNDC output offset quality, DNDC has been approved and is used for offset projects, but the DNDC simulations for this project were not intended to serve that purpose. It was more just to understand different trends, because in an offset application, we need more detailed information on agronomic practices that we cannot derive directly from a platform like OpTIS. We are also working with various standards and offset markets to demonstrate the use of OpTIS to support the markets. I know there was a question about using OpTIS to help the verification process, but it's also being used to help assess eligibility and other criteria that are part of offset markets that determine things like additionality and eligibility based on the criteria for each of the individual markets.
Great, thanks, Bill. Here's one for Linda, and this, I don't know if this fits into the scope of the study you discussed today, or any other work that you may be doing, but we have a question. Do you have an explanation for the higher cover crop use in Wisconsin?
Nope, I do not.
I
have not done any work up there in many years. So yeah.
Someone send us a master's student.
That's right. Exactly.
That, I think that would be fascinating to explore. I'm going to go to this one and kind of open it up. As the OpTIS AI is refined and/or field observation is expanded, particularly in the recently added areas, and our writer Zach is in Tennessee and Kentucky, what's the best way to use the current data? Analyze in conjunction with ag census data, or look for trends, or identify outliers. Anybody got any thoughts on the best way to use that OpTIS data? I'm going to throw this at Steve then, just to kind of get that started. Any ideas on how to best, I guess, use OpTIS data in the context of other data sets?
Yeah, that's a tough question. I think our speakers today did a fantastic job of demonstrating better than I can on some of the uses of the OpTIS data. I'm trying to think of yeah, if there are particular like watch-outs, or to answer this question of how not to use the OpTIS data. I mean, I think Bill highlighted limitations of the DNDC data and uses, in the sense that it's not intended to be an inventory, and those simulations, require, at the scale that we ran them, require so many assumptions about initial soil conditions and use of fertilizer inputs that they're not appropriate for an inventory. I don't think there are the same limitations on the OpTIS side. I think OpTIS, I guess one thing that we are working to add is we have this assessment of how well OpTIS works in comparison to field level results. What we're working to add is a confidence interval to each of our regional estimates. So to use what we know about how OpTIS matches up with field level data, to extend that to how OpTIS estimates, certainty around those OpTIS estimates at the watershed scale and political boundaries. So hope that will be ready for our next release. I think that would be one sort of important piece in continued widespread use of OpTIS information.
Great. Thanks, Steve. Another question that has come up a couple times is a question of timeline, and I think we're going to use this as kind of our wrap-up question. For those questions that we have not been able to answer today or that need some detail, we're going to get back to you and try to get all the questions answered offline. So we're hoping to continue the conversation and share information as we follow up on this. But as far as our last live question, Steve, there's some questions of timelines. We've talked about getting the Chesapeake, Mississippi Delta, Great Plains. There's some calls for Western states data. What are the timelines for expanding the data set?
Yeah, good question. So our focus right now is on the Chesapeake, Mississippi Delta, Great Plains, and we're well underway in terms of processing those data. In fact, we're into the QC process in those areas, and so the timeline there that we're looking at is early fall for release of those. Then in terms of California and the rest of the U.S., that's lined up next, and we're in the process of working with certified crop advisors to collect data so we can be ready to do the sort of validation needed out in those areas too. So we're looking at next year for the remainder of the U.S. beyond those three next geographies.
Outstanding. So we're coming up to the top of the hour, and I'm sure people have places they also need to go. So what I want to do is thank everybody for being part of this. Thanks to our speakers who've come in. Thanks to our participants and everyone who's asked questions. Like I said, we'll get answers back to you if we didn't get to answer your question during today's session. This video will be posted online, a video of this webinar, so you can go back and review it. It'll appear on the CTIC website as well as the Nature Conservancy's website. In the chat, you'll see a couple of links. Those are places you can get more information on OpTIS. And we encourage you to go in and check out the data set. There's a query page. There are tools for visualizations, which are really neat to work with, and also a lot of background on the program itself. So thanks again, and all the best for a great afternoon.
Thank you, Steve. Bye, everyone.